Late 1942. Coral Sea, 180 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. A lone Mitsubishi A6M0 carved through the dawn haze like a dying bird, trailing black smoke across a blood-stained sky. One wing dipped unnaturally. The engine coughed. Wet, rattling, finished. Inside the cramped cockpit, Ensign Tadayoshi Koga, barely 20 years old, tasted copper in his mouth and felt his vision swim. The oil pressure gauge read 0. He didn't know it yet. But in less than 3 minutes, he would attempt something no Japanese pilot had ever done. Land on an enemy carrier, alive, by choice. And the Americans watching him descend wouldn't fire a single shot because nobody on either side could process what they were seeing. The trap was already set in the clouds. A wounded enemy fighter with nowhere to go. A U.S. carrier crew bracing for a suicide dive. And a decision so unthinkable it would rewrite the Pacific Air War. But right now, Koga had one objective: keep his dying Zero airborne long enough to find somewhere, anywhere, to put down before the sea claimed him. His sortie had launched 4 hours earlier from Rabaul, a standard combat air patrol over the convoy routes near the Solomons. Standard. The word felt like a sick joke now. Nothing had been standard since Midway. Every mission felt like drawing straws, and someone always drew the short one. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this beautiful story. This morning, that someone was him. The American Wildcats came screaming out of the sun, hungry, coordinated, merciless. Koga's wingman, Nakamura, evaporated in a fireball before he could even call a warning. One moment. 4 planes in formation. The next. 3, then 2. Then just Koga alone, jinking hard, feeling bullets punch through his fuselage like fists through paper. He dove into a cloud bank, shook them off, and immediately realized the nightmare was just beginning. No radio, no compass, no fuel, no bearings. The Zero shuddered again, violently. Koga glanced at the instruments, oil pressure falling like a stone, coolant temperature screaming red. He scanned the horizon desperately, praying for the dark smudge of an island, for anything solid. Instead, he saw something worse. A shape. Massive. Steel gray, impossibly wide. An aircraft carrier. His heart seized. Please be ours. Please, please, please. He squinted through the oil-streaked canopy, and the prayer died in his throat. The deck was lined with aircraft he didn't recognize. Bulky, angular, wrong. The island superstructure painted in enemy colors. White stars on blue circles. American. A U.S. Navy carrier task force, right beneath him. The USS Yorktown, he'd learn later. Right now it was just his death, gift wrapped in gray steel. Koga's hands shook on the stick. If he turned away now, he'd ditch an open ocean within 2 minutes. If he stayed, they'd blow him out of the sky before he got within 1,000 yards. It wasn't a choice. It was a countdown to the same ending, just with different choreography. Unless... His training screamed at him. Death before dishonor. Never surrender. The Americans will torture you, kill you, make an example of you. His fuel gauge whispered something else. You're already dead. But you don't have to die in the water. Koga exhaled slowly, tasting blood and salt and terror, and banked gently toward the carrier. His landing gear dropped with a mechanical whine that sounded like surrender. On the flight deck of the USS Yorktown, the morning aircrew was securing tie-downs, when a lookout's voice cracked across the intercom. "Inbound aircraft, 0, low and trailing smoke." The deck erupted. Alarms shrieked. Sailors scattered to battle stations. Gunners swung their 20mm cannons skyward, fingers tight on triggers. But then someone noticed something that made no sense. He's not diving. He's slowing down. Wait, are those landing gear? Lieutenant Commander Wallace, the air boss, pressed binoculars to his face and felt his brain short-circuit. The 0 was coming in shallow, slow. Gear down, flaps extended. Configured for landing, not attack. "What in the hell?" Wallace breathed. A kamikaze would never lower his gear. A strafing run would come in fast and low. A reconnaissance plane wouldn't approach a carrier at all. This made no tactical sense. It defied every pattern they'd been trained to recognize. "Sir, orders?" a gunner shouted, tracking the 0 in his sights. Wallace's mind raced. Trap? Malfunction? Defection? "Hold fire!" he barked. "Hold your fire!" Koga didn't hear the order. He only saw the deck rising to meet him, a flat strip of salvation or execution. He couldn't tell which. The landing signal officer stood frozen on the platform, paddles hanging limp. His job was to guide friendly planes home. Not this. Never this. The 0 descended through the turbulent air currents boiling off the carrier's bow. Koga's knuckles were white on the stick. 50 feet, 30, 20. The engine gave one final cough and died. Just quit. The nose dropped. The deck rushed up like a fist. Sailors dove for cover. The LSO threw himself sideways. Someone screamed, "Brace for impact!" The 0 slammed onto the wooden deck with a sound like a car crash. Metal shrieking, wood splintering, the entire airframe shuddering as it bounced once, skidded sideways in a spray of sparks. Tailhook scraping past the first wire, the second, the third, and catching the fourth with a violent clang that jerked the aircraft to a shuddering stop. Silence. Not even breathing. Ensign Tadayoshi Koga sat trembling in the cockpit, disbelieving his own survival, staring at the deck he'd just landed on. The American sailors stared back, eyes wide, jaws slack, trying to comprehend the physically impossible thing they'd just witnessed. A Japanese 0, intact, on their carrier. The pilot slowly, carefully, raised his hands. Rifles came up. Safeties clicked off. But no one fired. Lieutenant Commander Wallace stepped forward, his voice steady despite the insanity, and spoke the words that would echo through naval history. "Secure the pilot. He's ours." Koga swallowed hard. He had no idea what awaited him below deck. Torture, execution, humiliation, everything his training promised. But his war in the air was over. The deck crew approached cautiously, weapons raised but fingers off triggers. This was uncharted territory. No protocol existed for this. The canopy cracked open. Koga's hands stayed raised, shaking from adrenaline and blood loss. He was young, painfully young, with oil streaking his face and blood matting his hair. A sailor, barely older than Koga himself, stared at him and whispered, "He's just a kid." Koga understood the word kid. He'd learned some English in school, but he kept his eyes forward, every muscle tensed, waiting for the violence his commanders promised would come. It didn't. Instead, a medic pushed through the crowd, medical bag in hand, and his first words weren't a threat. They were a question. "Can you walk?" And Ensign Tadayoshi Koga, trained to die rather than surrender, trained to believe Americans were monsters, felt his worldview begin to crack. 30 seconds earlier, the USS Yorktown's flight deck had been a picture of controlled chaos. The good kind. Deck crews hauled fuel lines, Ordnance teams loaded practice rounds. A flight of wildcats sat warming up for patrol rotation, their engines drumming a steady rhythm across the wooden planks. Then the lookout's voice shattered everything. "Bogey inbound, 0, bearing 270. The transformation was instant, hydraulic. Alarm screamed across every deck. Men abandoned their stations and sprinted toward battle positions. Gunners spun their 20mm cannons skyward, cranking elevation wheels, scanning the horizon with wild eyes. The Wildcats' engines revved higher, pilots ready to scramble if the order came. On the command island, Lieutenant Commander Wallace dropped his coffee and grabbed binoculars, pressing them hard against his face as he swung toward the bearing. Other officers crowded around him, shoulder to shoulder, breath held. "I've got him," Wallace muttered. "Low, 3 o'clock, trailing smoke." "Kamikaze?" someone asked, voice tight. Wallace tracked the Zero's approach. The flight pattern was wrong, erratic, wobbling, one wing dipping too low. Smoke poured from the cowling in ugly black ribbons. The plane looked like it was barely holding together. "Damaged," Wallace said. "Badly damaged." "So he's coming in for a last run," an ensign concluded. "Suicide dive." It made sense. It was the only thing that made sense. Wounded pilot, crippled plane, American carrier in range. Of course he'd try to take them with him. That's what they did. Wallace watched the Zero sink lower, lining up with the carrier's heading. His jaw tightened. "All gunners, prepare to fire. On my mark." Fingers curled around triggers. Breathing stopped. Every eye locked on the descending fighter. And then, the Zero's landing gear dropped. 2 small wheels extending from the fuselage with mechanical precision, flaps lowering, the plane slowing. "What the?" Wallace's voice died in his throat. "Did he just?" The ensign couldn't finish the sentence. On the deck below, a gunner lowered his weapon slightly, confusion written across his face. Is he trying to land?" Nervous laughter rippled through some of the crew, the kind that comes when the brain can't process what the eyes are seeing. Others just stared, mouths open, frozen. "It's a trick," someone hissed. "Has to be. He gets close, then detonates." "He's got no ordnance visible," another officer countered. "Look at him. He's barely flying." Wallace's mind raced through every tactical scenario he'd ever studied. Kamikaze pilots didn't lower landing gear. Attackers didn't configure for approach. Reconnaissance planes didn't fly straight at carriers. This was none of those things. "Sir?" A gunner's voice crackled over the intercom. "Do we fire?" Wallace's hand hovered near the comm switch. Fire, and they'd kill a potentially defenseless pilot. Don't fire, and they might let a bomb get within lethal range. He made the call. "Hold fire unless he attacks. Hold fire." Below, on the landing platform, the LSO stood paralyzed, paddles gripped uselessly in his hands. His job was to guide planes home. American planes. Friendly planes. Not this. The Zero descended through the carrier's turbulent wake, dropping lower, slower, impossibly close now. The entire deck held its breath. 800 men suspended between duty and disbelief, watching an enemy fighter line up for an approach that shouldn't exist. And still, Koga came on. The wind over the Yorktown's bow hit like a fist, turbulent, vicious, born from the carrier's speed cutting through open water. Koga wrestled the stick, every muscle in his arm screaming as the Zero pitched and yawed in the invisible currents. Hold it. Hold it. Just a little more. Below, the LLSO waved his paddles in wild, exaggerated arcs. The universal signal for wave off, abort, get out of here. But Koga had no idea what the gestures meant. He'd never trained for American carrier signals. He'd never trained for any of this. All he could do was aim for the deck and pray. Sailors scattered across the flight deck like startled birds. Some dove behind tie-down equipment. Others dropped flat, arms over their heads. A few stood rooted in place, unable to look away, unable to process the surreal physics of what they were watching. One mechanic's lips moved silently. Hail Mary, full of grace. The Zero wobbled violently at 50 feet. Smoke belched from the cowling in thick, oily clouds. The propeller stuttered, chug, 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 each rotation slower than the last, the engine gasping like a drowning man. Inside the cockpit, Koga's vision blurred. His arms felt like lead. Blood trickled warm down his temple. Forgive me, Mother. Forgive me, Father. I tried to die with honor. I swear I tried, but honor was in the clouds now, far behind him. All that remained was survival. Animal, desperate, shameful. Maybe they'll be merciful. Maybe the propaganda was wrong. Maybe... The engine died. Not sputtering, not coughing, just dead. The sudden silence was deafening. The propeller froze mid-spin, and the Zero's nose dropped like a stone. 30 feet, 20. The deck rushed up. Wooden planks and arresting wires and wide-eyed faces all blurring into one nightmare. Koga hauled back on the stick with everything he had left. Not like this. Not like... Crash! The Zero slammed onto the deck with a sound like a car wreck. Metal shrieking, wood splintering, the entire airframe shuddering on impact. It bounced once, hard, the landing gear compressing and releasing like a broken spring, then skidded sideways in a hellish spray of sparks. The tailhook scraped across the deck, screech, missing the first arresting wire, missing the second. "It's gonna overshoot!" someone screamed. The third wire whipped past, and then, clang! The hook caught the fourth wire with brutal, mechanical violence. The cable went taut. The Zero jerked to a halt so suddenly that Koga's head snapped forward, his harness cutting into his chest, driving the air from his lungs. Sparks showered across the deck. Men gasped, flinched, waited for the explosion. For the fireball, the secondary detonation, the blast that would turn the flight deck into an inferno. It didn't come. The Zero sat crooked and smoking. One wing dipped low, the propeller bent, the fuselage riddled with bullet holes. But intact, alive. And in the cockpit, hands trembling on the stick, sat Ensign Tadayoshi Koga, breathing, bleeding, disbelieving. The silence that followed was so thick, it felt physical. 800 men stood frozen, staring at the impossible thing before them. A Japanese Zero. On an American carrier. With the pilot still inside. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The war had just paused to catch its breath. Lieutenant Commander Wallace's voice cut through the silence like a blade, calm, steady, final. "Secure the pilot. He's ours." The words rippled across the deck, breaking the spell. Men moved, but slowly, cautiously, like approaching a live grenade. A squad of Marines emerged from behind equipment, rifles raised, boots scraping carefully across the wooden planks. No one ran. No one shouted. This was uncharted water, and every man knew it. Inside the cockpit, Koga heard boots approaching. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every breath tasted like copper and fear. This is it. This is where they kill me. His hands shook violently as he raised them, slowly, deliberately, above his head. The movement felt like betrayal, like severing himself from everything he'd ever been taught. Death before dishonor. Never surrender. They will torture you, make you beg. His instructor's voices screamed in his skull, but his hands stayed raised. The Americans closed in, 6, maybe 8 of them, weapons trained on his cockpit. Koga could see their faces now through the oil-streaked canopy. Young faces, hard faces, confused faces. One Marine, barely 19, stared at him and muttered, "Jesus, he's just a kid." Another sailor leaned in, squinting. "He's bleeding. Look at his head." "Could be a trick," someone warned. "Stay sharp." Koga's trembling fingers found the canopy release. The mechanism clicked. The glass slid back with a hiss of hydraulics, and suddenly there was no barrier between him and his enemies. The wind hit his face. Salt air, diesel fumes, the smell of American steel. He kept his hands raised, kept his eyes forward, waiting for the rifle butt to his skull, the boot to his ribs. The violence his commanders promised would come. It didn't. Instead, a Navy medic pushed through the ring of Marines, medical bag swinging from his shoulder. He stopped at the wing root, eyes scanning Koga's injuries with clinical detachment. "Can you move?" the medic asked. Koga didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Not hostile, not cruel, concerned. He tried to nod, but his vision swam. His strength, held together by adrenaline and sheer will, finally broke. His hands dropped. His head lolled forward. "He's going down," someone shouted. The medic lunged forward, catching Koga under the arms as his body went limp. 2 sailors scrambled up the wing to help, easing the unconscious pilot out of the cockpit with surprising gentleness. They lowered him to the deck. This enemy who'd just landed on their ship. This boy in a torn flight suit with blood matting his black hair. The medic pressed fingers to Koga's neck, checking his pulse. "He's alive. Pulse is weak but steady. Get a stretcher, now." The Marines lowered their rifles. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted, from lethal to wary, from combat to custody. Within minutes, Koga was strapped to a stretcher, a blanket tucked around his shaking frame. 4 sailors lifted him, and the procession moved toward the island superstructure, slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Behind them, the Zero sat alone on the sun-bleached deck, smoking, silent, its secrets still locked inside. But the pilot was theirs now, and everything was about to change. The moment Koga disappeared below deck, a different kind of chaos erupted. Commander Harris from Naval Intelligence practically sprinted across the flight deck, 2 technicians and a photographer scrambling behind him. He stopped 10 feet from the Zero, breathing hard, staring at it like a man who'd just stumbled onto buried treasure. "Nobody touches it," he barked. "Not until we document everything." The deck crew stepped back, forming a wide perimeter. Harris approached slowly, circling the aircraft with the careful reverence of an archaeologist uncovering something ancient and precious, because in a sense, he was. "Do you understand what we have here?" Harris whispered to his chief engineer, Lieutenant Briggs, who'd just arrived from below. "A fully intact A6M20, fully intact." Briggs let out a low whistle. "We pulled one from the Aleutians last year. Crashed in a bog, mostly whole." "Mostly," Harris emphasized. "That one had a mangled engine and structural damage. This?" He gestured at Koga's Zero. "This bird was flying 3 minutes ago. Everything's operational. The hydraulics, the fuel system, the controls, everything." The photographer moved in, flashbulbs popping as he captured every angle. The cowling, the wing surfaces, the tail assembly, the cockpit instrumentation. Each photograph was a potential revelation, a puzzle piece in understanding the machine that had dominated Pacific skies for nearly 2 years. Technicians swarmed next, notebooks out, sketching panel layouts and taking measurements. One knelt by the engine, running his fingers along the cowling seams with surgical precision. "Nakajima Sakai radial," he muttered. 14 cylinders. We've seen wreckage before, but never one we could actually study. Harris leaned into the cockpit, examining the instrument panel. The gauges were still warm, oil pressure 0, fuel nearly empty, blood on the stick where Koga's hand had gripped it. "This machine terrified us," Harris said quietly. "It outturned everything we had, outclimbed our wildcats. We lost pilots because we didn't know how to fight it." Briggs nodded grimly. "And now? Now we find out why." Harris straightened, his voice taking on an edge of urgency. "I want this bird stripped down, every component cataloged, every system analyzed. And then..." He paused, the weight of what he was about to say settling over him. "We fly it." Briggs's eyes widened. "Fly it?" "Sir, that's essential," Harris interrupted. "We need to know its limits, its weaknesses, where it breaks down, what it can't do." He looked back at the Zero, its rising sun emblem stark against the fuselage. "Somewhere out there, our pilots are dying because they're fighting blind. This machine," he tapped the wing, "this changes that." The deck crew watched in silence as panels began coming off, as the engine cowling was carefully removed, as America's most feared enemy was slowly, methodically dismantled into knowable parts. By sunset, the Zero would reveal secrets Japan never meant to share, and the Pacific Air War would never be the same. Koga woke to whiteness. Clean sheets, white walls, the sterile smell of antiseptic and gauze. For a moment, one blessed, confused moment, he thought he was back at Rabaul in the base infirmary after a rough landing. Then memory crashed over him like a wave. The carrier, the landing, the Americans. He jerked upright, gasping, and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his ribs. His head throbbed. Strong hands pressed gently on his shoulders, easing him back down. "Easy, son, easy." Koga's vision cleared. A Navy corpsman stood beside the bunk, middle-aged, graying at the temples, his expression more concerned than hostile. Behind him, an armed Marine stood watch, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The corpsman held up a cup of water. "Thirsty?" Koga stared at the cup like it might be poisoned. His throat was sandpaper dry, but his training screamed warnings. "They'll drug you, interrogate you, break you." The corpsman waited patiently, then set the cup on the side table within reach. "It's just water, I promise." Koga didn't understand all the words, but he understood the gesture, the lack of cruelty in it. He reached for the cup slowly, half expecting it to be slapped away. It wasn't. The water was cool, clean, and tasted like mercy he didn't deserve. A new figure entered, a younger man in officer's uniform holding a notebook. He spoke in halting textbook Japanese. "I am Lieutenant Morrison. I will..." "Translate. Are you in pain?" Koga's mind reeled. Translate? Not interrogate, not threaten, just asking if he hurt. His voice cracked. "I am your prisoner." Morrison nodded. "Yes, but also our responsibility. The doctor wants to know if your head wound needs stitches." Koga touched the bandage wrapped around his temple. Clean, professional. Not the brutal field dressing he'd expected, but care. "Americans will tear you apart," his instructor's voice echoed from training. "They'll parade you through streets, humiliate you, torture you for information. Better to die than let them take you alive. But here he was, alive, bandaged, given water, treated like a human being. The cognitive dissonance was almost worse than the pain. "Why?" Koga whispered in Japanese. Morrison frowned, consulting his phrase book. "Why what? Why haven't you—" He couldn't finish. His throat closed up. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then said carefully, "You're wounded. You're no threat. We're not savages." He paused, then added, almost gently, "Neither are you." Those last 4 words hit harder than any bullet. Koga turned his face toward the wall, shame burning through him. Relief and guilt twisted together until he couldn't tell them apart. He was alive, which meant he'd failed. He'd surrendered, which meant dishonor. His family would bear the stain of his cowardice. His country would suffer for his weakness. And yet, they gave me water. Over the next hours, medical staff came and went. They checked his wounds, adjusted his bandages, offered him broth. The Marine Guard never moved, but never threatened. Morrison returned periodically, asking simple questions, name, rank, where he was from, but never pushing when Koga stayed silent. By evening, something strange had begun to grow in the small, sick bay, a fragile, wary respect. Koga watched the corpsmen work, watched Morrison struggle with his Japanese, watched the Marine yawn and shift his weight like any bored sentry anywhere. "They're just men," he realized with quiet horror. "Just men, like us." As night fell and the ship's rhythm settled around him, Koga stared at the ceiling and wondered. What would his mother think? His father? His squadron? What would they say about the pilot who chose life over honor? And what secrets had his survival just handed to the enemy? 3 days later, at a secure airfield on Espiritu Santo, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders stood on the tarmac staring at Koga's Zero with a mixture of awe and dread. "You want me to fly that?" he asked. Commander Harris nodded. "We've gone over every inch. The engine's sound. Controls functional. We need to know what it can do, and more importantly, what it can't." Sanders circled the aircraft slowly. The rising sun insignia had been painted over with American stars, but it still felt wrong. Like climbing into the skin of a predator that had been hunting you for months. "She's a beauty," Sanders admitted. "Light, clean lines. I can see why they've been eating our lunch." "Then find out how to beat her," Harris said quietly. Sanders climbed into the cockpit. The seat was cramped, designed for smaller frames. The instrument panel was intuitive despite the Japanese characters. He ran through pre-flight checks, hands moving with professional precision even as his pulse hammered. The engine caught with a smooth, powerful roar. 20 minutes later, Sanders was airborne, and his worldview was being systematically dismantled. The Zero climbed like an angel, effortless, eager, almost joyful. At low speeds, it turned on a dime, responsive to the slightest input. He could see why Wildcat pilots had died trying to dogfight this thing. In a slow-speed turning battle, the Zero was untouchable. But then Sanders pushed the throttle forward. At 180 knots, the controls felt heavy. At 200, the ailerons started to stiffen. At 220, they locked up almost completely, the stick fighting him like it was set in concrete. "Well, I'll be damned," Sanders muttered into his radio. "She doesn't like high-speed maneuvers." He pulled into a steep climb, then shoved the stick forward into a -G dive, the kind of maneuver American pilots use to escape combat. The engine coughed, sputtered, nearly died. Sanders hauled back on the stick, leveling out, his heart racing. The carburetor couldn't handle negative G forces. The fuel flow cut out. "Got another one," he reported, grinning despite himself. "No negative G tolerance. She'll stall out in a dive." On the ground, engineers scribbled frantically. Harris listened to the radio transmissions, nodding slowly as each weakness revealed itself. The Zero was fast, but only at certain speeds. Maneuverable, but only at low velocity. Deadly, but only if you fought on its terms. "She's made of paper," Sanders called down after a close inspection of the airframe during a low pass. "No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One good burst and she'll light up like a torch." By sunset, the report was complete. Typed. Classified. Urgent. To all Pacific Fighter Squadrons, RE. Captured A6M20. Tactical analysis. Do not dogfight at low speeds. Use diving attacks above 250 knots. Exploit negative G vulnerabilities. Aim for fuel tanks. Aircraft has no fire suppression. The Zero is beatable. Repeat, the Zero is beatable. Harris watched the radio operator transmit the message, sending it rippling across the Pacific, to carriers, to airfields, to squadrons that had been bleeding pilots for months because they didn't know how to fight back. He thought of Koga, lying in sick bay 3 decks below on the Yorktown, unaware that his survival had just rewritten the rules of aerial combat. "That kid's plane," Harris said quietly, "just saved more American lives than a whole carrier group." The radio operator looked up. "Think we should tell him?" Harris shook his head. "I don't think he'd want to know." Koga heard the news through a bulkhead. He'd been moved to a secure compartment, still under guard, but with more space, a proper bunk, even a porthole that let in pale morning light. The Marine outside his door had grown familiar, sometimes nodding when their eyes met. But today, voices drifted through the thin steel wall. American voices, excited, urgent. "Confirmed from Espiritu Santo. The Zero's got a high-speed control problem. Stalls out in negative G dives, just like Sanders reported. No armor, no fire suppression. We hit the fuel tanks. It's over." Koga's blood turned to ice. They'd flown it, tested it, stripped away every advantage his aircraft had ever possessed. He pressed his forehead against the cold bulkhead, nausea rising in his throat. His Zero, Japan's most lethal fighter, the machine that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was being dissected like a laboratory specimen, and he'd handed it to them. Nakamura died in seconds. Tanaka burned alive over Midway. Yamada went down defending Rabaul. All of them had died with honor as they were taught. And Koga had survived, had chosen life, had landed his plane intact, functional, right into enemy hands. The shame was a physical weight, crushing his chest until he couldn't breathe. Outside his door, the voices continued. "New tactics memo goes fleet-wide tomorrow. Boom and zoom attacks only. Use our speed and diving advantage." About damn time. We've lost too many good men trying to turn-fight those things. Footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving Koga alone with the terrible mathematics of his failure. How many Japanese pilots would die because of what he'd done? How many battles would be lost? How many lives, American lives, would be saved because of his cowardice? Across the Pacific, the transformation was already beginning. On the carrier Enterprise, Commander Wade McCluskey briefed his squadron. "Forget everything you knew about fighting Zeros. No more dogfighting. We dive from altitude, make one pass, and extend away at high speed." They can't follow. In the ready room, pilots leaned forward, hungry for anything that might keep them alive. "Their ailerons lock up above 200 knots, McCluskey continued. Their carburetors can't handle negative G, and their fuel tanks light up like Christmas trees. We have them now, gentlemen. We have them. A cheer erupted. Men who'd watched friends die in flames finally had hope, had knowledge, had a fighting chance. The captured Zero had given them what no amount of courage could: understanding. Back on the Yorktown, Morrison brought Koga his evening meal: rice, fish, tea. Better than prisoner rations, almost respectful. "Thank you," Koga said quietly in Japanese. Morrison nodded, hesitating at the door. "You okay?" Koga looked up, eyes hollow. "My plane," he said slowly in broken English. "They fly it?" Morrison's expression shifted, sympathy mixed with something Koga couldn't quite read. "Yeah, they flew it." Koga closed his eyes. "I understand." After Morrison left, Koga sat alone in the dimming light, staring at his hands. The same hands that had pulled the landing gear lever. The same hands that had chosen surrender over death. Outside, sailors laughed and called to each other, the normal sounds of a warship at sea. Some of them nodded to him now when they passed. Small gestures, human acknowledgments. They didn't hate him. That was almost worse, because Koga was beginning to realize a terrible truth. His survival hadn't just saved his life. It had changed the war. 2 weeks later, Koga stood on the Yorktown's deck one final time, watching as his Zero was hoisted by crane onto a transport ship bound for the mainland. The morning sun caught the metal, making it gleam, no longer a weapon, but an artifact. A teacher. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had pulled the landing gear lever to save his own life. That single choice, made in desperation, in defiance of everything he'd been taught, had handed America the key to defeating Japan's most feared fighter. How many of my countrymen will die because I chose to live? The question had haunted him every night. But now, standing in the salt wind with Marine guards flanking him, Koga felt something else beneath the shame. A strange, awful clarity. War didn't care about honor. It cared about survival. And sometimes survival meant breaking every rule you'd ever believed in. In the command island, Commander Harris watched the crane work, a folder of reports tucked under his arm. The test data from Espiritu Santo. The tactical memos transmitted fleet-wide. The preliminary estimates from naval intelligence. Captain Buckmaster joined him at the window. "They're calling it the intelligence coup of the Pacific Theater." Harris nodded slowly. "One intact Zero. That's all it took. We've already seen the results. Our pilots are engaging with confidence now. Loss rates are dropping." "Because of him," Buckmaster said, glancing toward Koga's small figure on the deck below. "A 20-year-old kid who made an impossible choice." "He gave us more than his aircraft," Harris said quietly. "He gave us understanding. And in war, that's everything." They watched in silence as the Zero disappeared into the transport ship's hold, its secrets now property of the United States Navy. An hour later, Koga stood at the gangway, a small canvas bag containing his few possessions slung over his shoulder. Morrison waited beside him, ready to escort him to the transport that would take him to a POW camp in California. "Ready?" Morrison asked. Koga nodded. He was calm now, not peaceful, but accepting. The terror had faded. The shame remained, but it had company now. The memory of water offered, without cruelty. Bandages applied with care. A medic kneeling beside him asking, "Can you walk?" He had expected monsters and found men. Perhaps that was the real revelation. Not tactical, not strategic, just human. "Morrison-san," Koga said carefully, "my plane, it will help you?" Morrison met his eyes, debating how much to say. Finally, yes, it already has. Koga absorbed this, his expression unreadable. Then he bowed slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of something neither of them could quite name. As he descended the gangway, Koga glanced back one last time at the Yorktown's deck, the impossible stage where his war had ended and another had begun. Late 1942, Coral Sea. A lone zero trails smoke through a blood-dawn sky. Inside, a 20-year-old pilot fights to stay conscious, to stay airborne, to make a choice that shouldn't exist. He doesn't know that in 3 minutes, he'll land on an enemy carrier. He doesn't know that his survival will change the Pacific Air War. He doesn't know that decades later, historians will call it one of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs of World War II. Right now, Ensign Tadayoshi Koga only knows 3 things. His engine is dying, the ocean is waiting, and below him, impossibly, is a ship. He lowers his landing gear, a simple mechanical act that will echo through history, and commits to the unthinkable. In war, the most impossible choices sometimes become legend. And the moment a wounded pilot chooses mercy over honor, everything changes.